What's up, Covalence friends? Today we're going to be creating a bare bones Next.js template. This is at least the bare bones template that I like to start with. We will be using create next app, so there isn't going to be a whole lot of configuration in the get-go, but we're going to be adding a few things here and there to make the developer experience a little bit better and just a little bit easier moving forward, right? So this is essentially how I like to start every new website that I like to write. I like to start with this template. If you want to just go ahead and clone the repo, the link is in the description below, but make sure you subscribe before you clone that repo. Otherwise, we're going to get started. All right, so we're starting off with our Visual Studio Code open, and it's basically open just to an empty folder called projects. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new terminal in this folder, and I'm going to run npx create next app -ts. This is going to create our new next app using TypeScript. It's going to have all of the stuff we need for TypeScript out of the box. And we're going to do next template. That's just, we're going to name it, so you can name whatever you want, but our project is just going to be named next template. It's going to use yarn to install everything, and it's going to take a little bit. So resolving packages, it'll even kind of init, Git and all of that, but it's going to just kind of go through this and success. So we're going to want to cd into our next template now, right? So now we're actually inside the folder itself. Usually you could actually open up to this folder, and the way I have my Visual Studio set up, you might have it set up a little bit differently, but I have it so that node modules is hidden from view when it's in the root folder. Again, this is not the root folder. Typically I would open up a new editor to this folder, but we'll leave it open just for consistency's sake and for demo purposes. So this still ends up working. Let's go ahead and shrink this a little bit, and we're going to go open up our package.json, and we'll see that it created everything for us. It has all of our run scripts ready. It has a linting script, and our dev would be basically running it in localhost. And we have our dependencies and installed Next, React, React DOM, and then our dev dependencies, which include TypeScript. And so typically the way I kind of do this is I would create two new folders where I would create a components folder and a utils folder. And inside our components folder is going to be our components, like our nav bar, and then also something like a layout page, which is something that we'll actually create during this little initiation, or this little initialization that we're doing here for this next template. But for utils, I typically would just have something like an index.ts, and inside of my index.ts, you might just have a whole bunch of things like references, or it could have helper functions, but we're going to just export a const, and we're going to call it container. And typically what you could do here is if you wanted to kind of share a class across multiple components or pages, let's say you wanted your nav bar and your body container to kind of have the same width, kind of react the same. This would be a good way to do that. You could share a class across, and so typically, let's see, I'll pull this from another project. Typically, you might have something kind of like this, where you have max width screen XL, MX auto, which is going to center it, PX2, and then on large, you might have a little bit more padding on the side. So PX is going to be sides, and what these are actual Tailwind classes. So we're going to use a CSS framework library. You could use Bootstrap, you could use Tailwind, you could just do vanilla CSS. Really, whatever your forte is, or whatever your preference is, I would just go with that. But for consistency's sake, for this template, for this next template, we're going to use Tailwind. So that being said, we're going to yarn install Tailwind CSS, post CSS, and auto prefixer -jas save. Yarn add. Let's do that same thing with yarn add. Let's see, I'll just kind of. All right. Okay, so now we have our Tailwind CSS, our post CSS, and our auto prefixer. We're going to want to create a new file and call it post CSS config.js. And inside of this, we're just going to do our module.exports equals, and inside of here we have our plugins, and this is just going to be Tailwind CSS. And for now, we're going to leave that as an empty object, and we're going to have auto prefixer, also an empty object. All right, go ahead and do a new line there. And then we're going to have our Tailwind config, right? So we'll do our new file. Oh, and this actually got put in the wrong. See, this is why you want it in the actual root folder. That way this doesn't happen. But again, I just moved that into our next template, right? So that's actually inside of our, inside the proper folder now, right? So it's inside of our correct package. And then we're also going to add a new file, and we're going to call that tailwind.config.js. And this Tailwind config can get pretty crazy, but the very basics of it is just, you set a module.exports equals, all right, and then you have a content property, and this content property takes an array of strings. You have a theme, which is just an object, and typically you would have an extend object in here as well. So this is basically just a base template. We're not actually going to be using much of this, so realistically you don't have to actually fill all this out, but it's good to kind of have in here just for future notice. And when you actually if you do want to install a plugin like the typography plugin, for instance, you can plug it right into this array and you're good to go. But the content field is something that we want to use, and so we basically want to do our pages, our components, and our utils. So what we can do is we're going to have 3 entries in here, and our first entry can be our pages, and that's going to be pages /*/ dot, and then we're going to include JS, TS, JSX, and TSX. You can include only TS and TSX, but for the most part it's good to include everything just in case. And we're going to have our components, and this is going to be the exact same thing, so we can just go ahead and copy that. And then finally we have our utils, and in here you could set a separate class. You could have a separate file altogether for your Tailwind classes, for instance. So you could have a Tailwind.tss, or sorry, .ts in here that only includes classes. That might speed up a little bit of the processing, but for this case I'm just going to include my index.ts in there, because for right now we're not going to have any helper functions, and even if we do, we might just have a few. So for right now, that's just going to contain our potential helper classes, right? Or our helper variables, however you want to say it. So we're going to just include that one file. Again, you could have a separate file for that, because typically you're not going to find Tailwind classes in your utils functions or anything like that. So you could, but we'll keep that strictly to here. So basically that content array, what it's doing is it's purging every other class in Tailwind that it doesn't find in this content array, right? So it's going to go through all of these pages, look for all the classes, and then those are the classes that it's going to include in your final build, right? So it's keeping the CSS as small as possible. It's very useful, very helpful, and definitely something that you want to utilize for sure. All right, so we have our Tailwind in here. We have post CSS and Tailwind configured. The only other thing we need to do now is we actually have to add our Tailwind to our global.css, right? So we have styles, we have our globals here, right? We have some stuff in here, and all we need to do is we actually need to import at Tailwind base, at Tailwind components, and at Tailwind utilities, right? So we have to import these 3 things. It's going to include in our global, and then any of our CSS we can actually overwrite after the fact, right? So we can overwrite these Tailwind classes if we need to. Hopefully we never need to. That's definitely not the idea, but if you really need to, you can, right? All right, so using also, one other thing I like to do is I like to actually add since we're using TypeScript, I like to add a models folder as well. And so what we put in here, we'll put our models.d.ts. And one of the things that we can actually do in here is that we can define any of our any of the models that we're going to be using, right? So if we're grabbing stuff from a server, maybe we have database models in here, we can define them in here, and then we can reference them from anywhere inside of our app, right? So we don't need to actually define interfaces in particular files and then export them and import them. We can just define them in the d.ts and we can reference them anywhere, right? So we're declaring this module essentially globally within this project, and then we'll be able to reference these models, from wherever, right? So, all right. So we have our components. We have our components folder, or we have our components folder. We have our models folder. We have our pages, which you can see uses TSX, right? So I can pull this up. We have our, our home page right here, and then we have our app.tsx, which just basically pulls in the component itself, right? And it has our app prop and everything. So it looks good so far. And Next kind of handles all of that, so we didn't have to do any of that, which is extremely convenient. And now we're pretty much ready to go ahead and run this thing. One more thing I think we do need actually before we keep going is I like to yarn add Prettier. So Prettier just allows us to run a command that'll allow us to kind of make some stuff a little bit better looking. And the way that Prettier works is you have to add a file called Prettier rc.json. So it's a JSON file. And inside of this JSON file, you basically define what Prettier needs. And some of the stuff I personally like, I like trailing comma to be ES5. I like tab width to be 4. I like single quote true. I like bracket same line to be true, and arrow parens always. All right, and then in our package.json, we can add an additional script that will allow us to actually format this. So I tend to like just the let's say add a comma. I tend to like just the name format, and what we're going to be doing is Prettier. We'll set the log level warn, and we will write, and we're going to write to components, pages, and utils /*/* dot ts and tsx. So we're only going to be formatting the ts and the tsx, and finally we just encompass that in our double quotes. And so if we run yarn run format, oh, I messed something up here. I forgot to close this clearly. There we go. So we're going to save that. We're going to yarn run format again. All right, and it was quick because we don't have that many pages and everything is already formatted. So make sure you enclose those brackets. And all right, so everything looks pretty good now. We should be more or less ready to go. Let's go ahead and just yarn run dev to make sure that we're actually looking good here. So we're gonna pop open a web browser, and we're gonna go to localhost 3000. All right, so we're actually running everything. We see that we have our Next.js app. This is the default homepage that you get when you use Create Next App, and everything's running on localhost 3000. So that's looking good. One other thing that I think is kind of cool to do, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna grab some pictures in here, and I want to do a kind of like Covalence image here. So let's see, I'm gonna use this Covalence padded image here. Actually, let's go ahead and we're going to create a favicon. So let's go ahead and just use the big one here. So let's go to public, and we're going to create a new folder called favicon, and then a new folder called logos. And inside of our logos, I'm going to add this file here, Covalence transparent.png, right? A little bitmappy, it's not the biggest file, but we won't need it to be very big. All right, and then there's actually some pretty decent like favicon generators online. So let's see if I can pull one up real quick. Real favicon. Let's try this one. Yep, PNG to ICO. So we're actually going to drag and drop this thing. Let's go ahead and find this. So we have it, and we need to open this guy. and then we're going to drag and drop it in here, and we're going to download it. So it's going to create this favicon, zip file. So we have that downloaded now. I'm going to go ahead and extract it. All right, and then I'm going to add the entire thing, all of the contents, to this favicon folder, right? So it creates all these Android, Chrome, different sizes for PNGs. It creates different sizes for favicons for the browser as well. The nice thing about this is that it's transparent and it makes your tabs look a little bit better. So you actually have some slightly higher fidelity favicons rather than just this ICO file, which is never the best. It's kind of blurry, but you can see that these favicons are a little bit more high fidelity, work a little bit better. So I generally like to generate better favicons, and we'll be able to actually reference those when we create our pages. So let's go ahead and look exactly how it's created right now. So you can see that we're currently running everything. If we change anything, it will update that. But you can see we have our head here with our title, and then we have our main, everything right here, right? And so more or less, this is a good way to do it. I mean, we could create every one of our pages this way. We could have our head separately on every page. It's not typically my favorite way to do this stuff. So the way that I actually like to set up my next project is a little bit different. I like to create a component, and what the component will actually be is it's going to be a layout component. So we're going to create a new folder. I like to create a new folder for each one of my components. And inside of that folder, we're just creating a layout.tsx. So go ahead and new file, and we'll call it layout.tsx. All right, so in our layout.tsx, we can go ahead and we can import, or we're going to need to import quite a few things. But for instance, one of the things that we're going to want to do is we're going to first we're going to define our actual function. So we'll say const layout equals, and it's going to be a function. And basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to export that default layout. So export default layout. And this function itself is actually going to kind of take in a good number of things. But what it really is it's actually going to be a React. So we can actually define React dot, and it's going to be FC. And the FC is going to take in a generic, right? And so we haven't defined this generic yet. So let's go ahead and kind of define this generic, and we can define it as a type, and we can say layout props, and this is going to be react.props with children, and the type itself is going to take in a generic, and this generic is going to contain things like title, which is an optional title. We could have a description, and we could have any number of things in here, right? So we could actually have more than just a title. We can have all of our open graph properties, which I'll explain in a little bit. But this generic is going to go here. And then inside of this, we're actually going to define our children, right? So these will be the children of the element itself, right? When we actually put this element on another page, we'll have our title, and we can actually set a default value for this. So let's just call it Covalence for now. We'll have our description, which we'll say coding bootcamp. We'll say online software education. Why not? All right, Covalence online software education, and in here we're going to return, and we're going to return, for right now we'll just return this empty fragment. Right now, obviously that's going to change. We'll probably return, some kind of div container, and we're going to do all of that in 1 second. But we don't have any errors anymore, so everything's compiling just fine. And we actually haven't even needed to import anything. So typically, you're going to probably have to import something like use effect or use state or something along those lines. You may not need a use state, but a use effect might be good. And if you wanted to kind of do something like you want another component like a nav bar or a footer, you're going to want to import those as well. So most likely you're going to have imports up here, so we'll just leave some space for those, because again, you're going to want to import like something like the nav bar or a footer bar, right? All right. So the first things that we can kind of do, actually I know exactly what we can import, because the one thing that we are going to have, which is a major part of this, is going to be our head, and it's going to be from next/head. All right, so inside of here, we're going to actually have this, and like I said, we're going to change this to be a div, and we may have something like, class name equals, container. So this is never a bad thing to kind of do along these lines. So we're going to have this overarching container on every page, and that container, may have something like the properties, that we were talking about before. So this is going to be the entire app container, that's going to be surrounding the nav bar and the footer and all of that as well. So again, it's not extremely important. You may not want this, right? You may just want to have your elements stacked separately, but it's never a bad idea to have everything in one element, right? It makes it a little bit easier for React actually. But inside of here, you can have the head, right? This is the head element, and inside the head element, we're going to have our title, and it's actually going to have the title inside of it, right? So we're going to use this. We can pass this in on any page, and then we're going to start having our links. So I'm going to go ahead and copy these into here real quick, but typically you would have these links in here for the Fav icon. So you're going to have your Apple Touch icon, you're going to have your Fav icons defined here, the 32 by 32 and the 16 by 16. There are additional ones for the Android if you want. It's not super important, but you can also have your icon, which is the just generic Fav icon, and these are all done inside. As you can see, it's inside of our public folder, and Fav icon is the root, so this will actually get all this. And we can also define our Android ones as well. We don't have to if you don't need to, but again, this is typically how you would define these, and you could go as crazy as you want. You could even have ones for MS specific stuff, but for the most part, this is what you're going to need here. This will work on most browsers, and this includes, again, your Apple Touch icon and your browser Fav icons, right? All right. So you could have additional meta properties in here. For instance, the meta name equals description, which we are passing in, and the content is going to equal description. And you could go and do all of your actual Open Graph data as well. So Open Graph data is things that, like, Facebook uses quite a bit. You could have, there's things like site name, type, title, description. They all have different Open Graph names, and typically it's something along these lines. So you could, since we have the two properties, we'll go ahead and we'll just put them in there. So the property is actually OG title, and the content is going to be title. And the same goes for description. So property equals OG description, content equals description. All right, and you can keep going with that. You can have images, different images. You can define your image height, the site name, everything along those lines. So let's go ahead and just do one more, just because this is a big one. We'll just do OG site name, content equals, for this we'll put Covalence. Obviously, if you're using this template, you're going to want to change that. But again, we have everything kind of defined here, and looks pretty good, right? So this is our layout. So now we're going to actually have inside of this div, here is where you could have something like a nav bar, right? Which we haven't actually built yet. Then we would have inside of this, we may have our main, and inside the main, we'll have our children. And then we may have something like a footer under that. All right. So we want everything inside this main. Now, each of our pages Doesn't have to define main, it can just define what's inside of main, right? All right. So let's go back to our index page here. And instead of kind of creating everything out like this, what we're actually going to do is we're going to change things up a little bit. We're going to import our layout, and we are going to then add our layout, and we're going to return our layout basically as the the root function here, right? So let's go ahead and, or the root component is what I meant to say. All right, so we're going to import layout. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. Import layout from components layout. And we are going to now, instead of returning all of this, which we don't need any of this anymore, right? We can delete almost all of this. So let's go ahead and just remove it all. And we're going to return our layout, right? And inside of this, we're basically just defining our base things, right? So this could be, we'll say, Covalence home, just to show you that it actually does change this. We'll have our description, which will be, let's say, the best online software education. We'll just say premium, right? Premium online software education. Bam. All of that. All right. And then we'll go ahead and we'll end that. And we're going to open this up. And basically all of this will be the children now, right? So what we can do is we'll add a section in here. And inside of this section, we can go ahead and we can do things like we can import, class name equals container, and then we're going to import container. We can remove all of these for now. We can leave the styles because the styles are specific for this page, but we are going to import from utils, and we're going to import container. All right, so then we have our class defined in here. And so we should be more or less good to go. All right. So just to make sure that this actually works, we're going to let it compile. We're going to now pop open our browser, go to localhost 3000. All right, we have our Covalence home up here. Hopefully you guys can see that. Let's open up our dev tools. And, well, let's do something a little bit more exciting, huh? All right, so inside of our section, we're just creating our hello world Covalence, and you can see here that we got our stuff. It's obviously not the best looking thing. What we can do is we can start adding some Tailwind names in here. So we'll say this class name is container, right? We're gonna put a div inside of here, and inside this div we're going to add a class. And we're going to say that it is going to be text center. And we will say padding Y10. And inside of this, we're going to say this is going to be text 3XL and font medium. Actually, let's say semi-bold. And here, class name is going to be text XL, and we'll say that it's going to be text gray 500, and we're going to say font medium. All right, so we're going to have everything recompiled here. Reload, and it actually does live reloading, so we don't have to refresh the page. And there we go. So we have hello world from Covalence, and you can see that we do have, let's see if I can zoom in. I can't actually zoom in on this, but you can see that the Covalence home is in there. And if you look in our head, you can see that the description here, let's see, there we go. You can see that the description here is premium online software education. So the layout is working. We have all of our scripts done in here. And if you wanted to kind of expand this layout to be, even more robust, what you could do is you could actually add all of your Google Analytics in here. You could add some script tags, things like that, that are going to be needed for additional processing and additional user handling and like, basically data collection, right? So all the data collection that you need can go in this head, and every single page that you create. So if we come in here to pages, right? So we have our index, but if we wanted to create an about page, about.tsx, we're going to just do the exact same thing as our index, where we import layout. That becomes our, our root component. And then everything inside of the layout is going to be our children, which is passed through, and our head and everything is taken care of just by these properties here. So again, this is more or less kind of the base project that I like to start with for every Next app. And I hope you guys can use this and utilize it moving forward. All right, so I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope that you actually get to use this template moving forward. Remember, the link to this repo is in the description below. If you guys have any suggestions for things that should be added to the template, feel free to post them in the comments. Make sure you subscribe, and we will see you soon with another video.